This is Gary Stieber with a message from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Matthew writes about Jesus as the Messiah, and my study Bible says that Matthew's main purpose is to prove to his Jewish readers that Jesus is their Messiah. His basic theme is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies of a coming Messiah, a king, and he does that by showing how his life and ministry fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures. Matthew shows that Jesus is the king forecasted from long ago, and he can be found by those who want to worship him. Now, Matthew begins his gospel by laying out the case for Jesus being the Messiah. He gives us his ancestry in the first half of chapter 1, and he gives us some details on his birth in the second half of chapter 1. Luke gives us the genealogy from Mary's side, which gives Jesus royal blood. Matthew gives us the genealogy from Joseph's side, which gives Jesus royal privilege. And in chapter 2, Matthew continues to lay out his messiahship, his kingship, verified by Gentile wise men from the east, and by the way that God orchestrated things in the stars in the heavens. Now, the birth of Jesus is certainly one of the most widely known stories in all of history. And this week we specifically focus on the visit of the wise men, the Magi, to the infant Christ child. Now, we're all familiar with the story of the wise men, but it might be helpful to kind of set aside what we think we know about them and let the Bible speak for itself and draw what we can from recorded history and make some, educated speculation along the way. So let's dive into Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." This is roughly 1 to 2 years after Jesus was born. In verse 7, we're told that Herod learned from the wise men roughly when the star had appeared. And in verse 16, Herod orders all of the boys 2 years old or younger to be killed. Here's a question for you. Do you remember the Harry Chapin song, Cats in the Cradle? It starts like this: "My child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way." Now, Jesus was born 2,000 years ago, and he came to the world in the most unusual way. But that's a story for another lesson. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The word Bethlehem means house of bread. And in John chapter 6, verse 36, we're told that Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." How fitting is it that the house of bread would be the site of birth for the bread of life, who would grow up, die, and then be raised from the dead, that he might be able to nourish the entire world with spiritual bread. Now, it's also been said that many of the animals for the sacrificial ceremonies in Jerusalem came from the area around Bethlehem. Now, if that's true, how fitting it is that Jesus would be born among the sacrifices. And it says that this is the days of Herod the king. What were those days like? Well, we're going to try to look at that and peel the onion layer back a little bit as we go along here. Now, Herod had been referred to as the king of the Jews by the Romans for more than 35 years at this point. Herod was roughly 70 years old at the birth of Jesus, and yet he becomes threatened by this newborn child. The NIV Study Bible says that Herod was a non-Jew, an Idumean, who was appointed king of Judea by the Roman Senate in 40 BC, but he didn't gain control of the area until 37 BC. And that 3-year period of time from the year 40 to year 37 BC turns out to be very important and very instrumental in our story here, and we're going to see that as we go along. Now, like many of the rulers of the day, Herod was a ruthless man. He murdered one of his wives, 3 of his sons, his mother-in-law, his brother-in-law, and many others. He executed many of his own descendants who might have made a claim to his throne days before his own death. And he is said to have ordered the execution of many prominent people in Jerusalem upon his death because he knew that nobody would weep for him at his death, but he wanted weeping in Jerusalem when he died. And Matthew mentions wise men from the east. The first recorded worshipers in Luke were poor Jewish shepherds, and now we see rich Gentile wise men giving us a foreshadow of Jesus' life. His purpose was to be Savior of the world, to both Jews and Gentiles, to wealthy and to the poor alike. The word translated wise man here is magos in the Greek. Many versions translate the word as magi. Now, we're sort of conditioned into thinking that there were 3 of them. The word magos is in the plural, but we don't really know how many there were. Many commentators believe that it was far more likely that this group consisted of a large entourage of hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And for reasons that we'll see in a moment here, this group probably had a large security force associated with it, and that meant that they had to have a substantial group of support people to move everything along, to feed everybody, animals, all kinds of things. This was far more likely to be a very large group of people rather than 3 wise men. Now, the Blue Letter Bible describes the word magus as the name given by the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Medes, the Persians, and others to wise men who were teachers, they were priests, they were physicians and astrologers, they were seers, they were interpreters of dreams, they were sorcerers, all those kinds of things. That's a wide range of activities. And they most certainly were not kings, like in the song We Three Kings. These were the kind of people who kings kept and often sought counsel of, and they had great influence in their home country. And as we go along here, we'll understand that their home country was likely the Parthians. Now, this group of people being closely tied to the kings in an advisory role would also be heavily involved in the grooming and perhaps even the selection of future kings. In Acts chapter 7, verse 22, it tells us that Moses was instructed in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians. And a similar thing no doubt happened in other countries as well. And the Magi could very well be the people who provided the best education for the elite of the country. And in that sense, they were king makers. And many commentators refer to the Magi as king makers. They were priestly, they were politically powerful, and they were widely sought after. And I like the way Alistair Begg sums it up. Alistair Begg says that they were theological scientists, or scientific theologians, if you prefer it that way. They studied the movements of the stars, and they believed that in some way, some force had a governing or influencing impact on both life and history. You see, they studied these cosmic activities, they studied ancient books, they studied dreams and visions, and he described them as wise people, sincere people, trying to figure out the things of life. Let me ask you a question. Does that describe you? Not that you're studying the stars and dreams and visions, but are you a wise person, a sincere person, sincerely trying to figure out the things of life? Well, if so, you're on the right track. God wants us to be thinking people, not people waiting around for an emotion or a feeling to hit us. You see, the Magi knew things, and they were on a mission, not to find a king, but to coronate a king, so to speak. And we're told that they come from the east. In a previous lesson, we saw that in the Bible, relative to Jerusalem, generally speaking, good things come from the east, and this is another example of that. And as to where the east is, we're not specifically told, but many believe that the east here to represent Babylon, which is now part of the Parthian Empire. And the wise men as a group of people referred to as magicians and enchanters, sorcerers, back in Daniel chapter 2. They were called in to interpret King Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and in Daniel chapter 5, Daniel becomes the third ruler in the kingdom, a position many believe to include rulers over this group. Now, if all that's true, it would explain a lot about how this group of people knew anything at all, really, about the coming of a very unique king, and that this king was to come from a particular area, and they would be familiar with Daniel's prophecy about the Messiah and the timetable that was all laid out in Daniel chapter 9. And they ask, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? And this is the essence of the story. And this is the essence of the story. Jesus is King of Kings. Jesus is the King of the Jews. And in verse 4 of chapter 2, the King of the Jews is equated with the Messiah of the Jews. And Jesus doesn't assume the throne in his first advent, but rest assured he will be the King of the Jews in his second coming. And he'll be returning as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It tells us that in Revelation chapter 19, verse 16. Now let me ask you a question. What is the title of a male born to a king? Well, they're referred to as a prince. And the shocking thing about this statement is they don't ask where is the one born to become king when he grows up. They don't ask where is the one to become king after you. They ask where is the one who is already king, being that way from birth. And John Piper has an interesting observation here. Right now in America, there may be 3 or 4 small children under the age of 18 who will grow up one day to be president of the United States. And you know how many people are seeking them today? Nobody. You see, Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the King. He's the King of the Jews, and He's the King of the universe, and that He should be treated as such. And the fact that this question is associated with whatever it is they saw in the stars, it implies that they know something about the fact that a special king was to come with some special celestial signal. And if this group did in fact come from Babylon, they may have gained knowledge of the coming king, the Messiah, from Daniel himself and during his captivity some 500 years earlier. Now Herod is known to have had somewhere between 9 and 11 sons, all of which would be adults at this point. He would know of any child that was to be born into the royal line. So let's hold on to that point and move on. It says that we saw his star, not just a star, but his star. And in the Greek, there's sort of a double emphasis here. This is his star, the star. This is the star that is his. It's that kind of a thing. Let me ask you a question. Who has stars that are theirs? And beyond just having a star, all the stars are his, and he arranged them all so that they would be a sign for the Magi. Now, whatever they saw, they associate it with three things. They associate it with birth, they associate it with the Jewish nation, and they associate it with kingship, and a unique kingship at that. Now, much has been speculated as to what this heavenly body or bodies were that made up the star, and you can search that online. One of the studies that I really like on the topic is done by Rick Larson, who's an attorney by background, and his website is www.bethlehemstar.com. Bethlehem Star, all one word. And you can search on YouTube the Star of Bethlehem. It's a fascinating study on what is referred to here as the star, what it may have actually been. Now, Horace Greeley is credited with the phrase, "Go west, young man, go west." Now, the star literally made this group of people go west in search of something. In Isaiah chapter 60, verse 3, it says, "And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." Now, if they did come from Babylon, as we're suggesting here, the round trip from there and back by the normal trade route would be something around 1,600 miles, and it would take several weeks at least. This took a considerable expense as well as a considerable amount of time. It wasn't something that they took up out of a mild curiosity. And the wise men certainly held some sort of official position wherever they came from. And they had to leave whatever those circumstances were, and they were gone for an extended time. Now let me ask you a question. If you were following a star, why would you stop in Jerusalem to ask for directions? Well, the short answer is because God wanted them to. But in a practical sense, maybe they lost sight of the star momentarily because of the weather or something like that. And if you were searching for a king in Israel, what better place would there be to go than into Jerusalem and into the palace where the king would most likely be? And they say we have come to worship. The Magi become the first Gentiles to worship Jesus. Let me ask you a question. Why would Gentiles from the east come to worship a Jewish king? You see, kings come and go after all. They must have known that this was no ordinary king. This wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime event. This was a once-in-history sort of an event. And if they did in fact come from Babylon, they likely had some knowledge of what an extraordinary event this was going to be and an idea of the timetable from Daniel's captivity. And Matthew wants us to know that all the world should worship Jesus as king and as Messiah. Verse 3, "When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born." It says he was troubled. Why was Herod and all Jerusalem troubled by this? Well, let's think about that. What was their expectation of the coming Messiah? Well, the Jewish expectation was for a political and a military leader, and Herod was connected to the Roman government who put him in service as the king. And the people hated the Roman government. Now, Herod's ego likely made him think they saw a star. What about my star? Don't I have a star? I'm the king. And whatever the wise man saw was somewhat normal looking, but incredibly unique at the same time to the trained eye. And by normal looking, what I mean by that, it wasn't like a fireball flashed and lit up the entire sky in a way that nobody could miss. It wasn't like that. And like most of us, we look up and we see stars, and we know that there are stars up there, and we know that there's planets up there, but we don't really examine the sky looking for movement and specific features and that kind of thing. It's also interesting that Herod doesn't argue with them. Hey, you're looking for the one born of the king? Well, you're about 70 years late. I'm the one that's king. You're looking for the king? Hey, you found him. And as king, succession to the throne would be of paramount importance to a 70-year-old king. Having already killed 2 of his own sons he thought to be a threat to the throne, the Magi have told him that there is already a king of the Jews. And Herod's ego certainly wouldn't allow for anyone other than him to select a future king to succeed him. He couldn't have possibly understood the ramifications of what was happening. Now let me ask you a question. What was the political situation at the time? We know that the Romans occupied Israel, and we know that Herod was put in place by the Romans, and they have this sort of mutual interdependence with each other. Stephen Collins writes that the land to the east, what used to be Babylon and Persia, they're now part of the Parthian Empire. And in the decades before Jesus was born, there was at least 3 major battles between the Romans and the Parthians. There was war between 63 and 58 BC. There was another battle in 55 BC. And the Romans suffered a major defeat by the Parthians in 40 BC. And that battle was close enough to Israel that it made Herod flee Jerusalem for fear of his life. Herod was out of power for 3 years between the year 40 BC and 37 BC. And Israel at that time fought for independence from Rome with the aid of the Parthians. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's all like really ancient history, right? But let's have a little perspective here. All of those events was closer to the Jews at the time of the birth of Jesus than the end of the Vietnam War was to us today here in America. You see, there's many people alive who lived it, remember it, and there's many people alive who heard about it from the people who lived through it firsthand. To the Jews in this period of time, many of those remember that period fondly, and they favored the Parthians over the Romans. Now here's the setting. What appears to be an official delegation of the enemy to the force that occupies your land showed up, and they're asking, where's the new king? And as stated before, this would have been a large contingent. This would be a large group of high-level officials traveling in the enemy territory. Now they have peaceful intentions, but they need a security force for their own protection. And we're going to find out later that they're also carrying precious cargo. And we're not told how much, but they may want additional security with them for that reason. And the historian Josephus records that the Parthian trading caravans generally included tens of thousands of people. This could easily be the group the size of a small city coming into Jerusalem. And if all that's the case, it wouldn't be unreasonable for Herod to fear that another major battle between the Romans and the Parthians was brewing. The Parthians are seeking the Messiah, who many expected was going to be a military sort of figure. And all of this could very likely mean war. And Israel is right in the middle between the great power on the west, the Romans, and the great power to the east, the Parthians. Now let me ask you a question. If the enemy to the force that occupies your land shows up and they said they wanted to worship the new king and they assure he was already born, what would you think? Now, with all that going on, why else might all of Jerusalem be troubled? And let me ask you a question. What does the term all mean? It means all. Everybody saw this large entourage. They see the Parthian entourage is in town, and they know the history. And they know that if Herod is troubled, people usually die. And you can't always predict how that's going to play out. And Herod calls all of the chief priests and the scribe. The chief priests, well, they are just what that sounds like. They're the leader of the priests and the priestly activity. And the scribes, well, they were the lawyers. They were the experts and the interpreters of the Jewish law. And the question is where the Christ was to be born. And the term Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, and the King of the Jews, those are all references to the same thing, or in this case, the same person. Verse 5, and they told him in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. You see, this entire ensemble of priests and scribes probably could recite this in unison. And likely every Jew knew the answer to this question, but Herod didn't. You see, they had the knowledge in their head, but they didn't have it in their heart. They knew the answer to the question, but we'll see that they have no follow-up. They have no action. The knowledge doesn't drive any kind of response in them. And let me ask you a question. Many of us know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and that's something we carry around in our head, you know? But does the knowledge of Jesus impact the way we live? Is it something that you hold into your heart? Verse 7, Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. He met with them secretly. The first meeting may have been a great public spectacle, but not this one. This one is in secret. And the word ascertain there means he investigated diligently and accurately. And we see the reference to a child. The Greek word is paidion, and it means an infant. Again, it's a different word than what Luke uses to describe the baby in Luke chapter 2. Jesus is now what we might call a toddler, likely between 1 and 2 years old. Let me ask you a question. Knowing the paranoia of Herod and the gravity to his personal situation, why didn't Herod send some spies along to follow the Magi? It would have been easy to do. It would have been hard to miss them. It wouldn't have been hard to follow. Well, we're not told. And perhaps he did, which is why Joseph was told to get out of there fast in verse 13. And maybe he didn't. And if not, I don't really have an answer for that, other than that it wasn't part of God's plan. And Herod says that I too may come and worship him. This lie is spoken privately, secretly. Verse 9, After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, if they did in fact lose sight of the star for whatever reason, they pick it up again. Now, whether Herod gave them directions to Bethlehem or not, they now have the divine GPS working again. And there's nothing to indicate that Herod or anyone else picked up on whatever the star was. And they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Joy comes to those who seek him. Verse 11, And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And we see at this time Jesus is in a house. The Greek word okia is a different word than Luke uses to describe the manger or the inn in Luke chapter 2. And we see Jesus with his mother Mary, no mention of Joseph here, though we know he's still alive because the angel appears to Joseph in verse 13. And it says they worshiped him. And it's important to know that before they gave their gifts, they gave their heart. They were overjoyed when they saw the star, but when they saw the child, they worshiped. And the gifts here are symbolic in nature. They were prophetic of the role that Jesus would fulfill. And we see the gift of gold, a gift fit for any king. Let's ask a question here. How much gold did he get? Well, we're not told, but given the background of what's happening, it may have been a pretty significant amount. It no doubt carried the family through, likely for years. And gold was not only valuable in its own right, but it was a gift fitting for a king. And the Eastern Gentile kingmakers gift Jesus the gift of kings. In Isaiah chapter 60, verse 5, it reads, The wealth of the nations shall come to you. Let me ask you a question. Do you worship him as king? Are you subject to his desire for you? And we see the gift of frankincense. It's a highly prized resin from the boswellia tree, which grows in northern Africa, Oman, and Yemen. And they would tap the tree for the sap. Think about harvesting maple syrup. They would dry the sap, and then when it was burned or ground, it gave off an incredible aroma. It was used for incense and was highly sought after. It was used for the ordination of priests, and it was used by the priest in the grain offering, the thanksgiving offering described in Leviticus chapter 2. So we have incense given to a child here. That's kind of an odd gift, but his role is to be the high priest. He intercedes for us. In Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, it reads, Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confessions, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one in whom every respect has been tempted as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Jesus is referred to as our great high priest. In Revelation, we're told that the incense represent our prayers and that they're stored in gold bowls attended by the heavenly council before the throne of God. Revelation 5, verse 8 reads, And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and gold bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And this would serve as an intercession type of a role. And Jesus is our high priest who intercedes for us with the Father. And Skip Heitzig has a point here. We have imagery here of priests from afar bringing a substance that priests used in the Jewish temple to someone who fulfilled the role of a priest in the future. And we have the gift of myrrh. Like frankincense, it's a resin that comes from a tree. Myrrh comes from the Commiphora tree, if I'm saying that right, and it grows in Arabia, India, and Northeast Africa. Now, the Greek word that's translated myrrh here is the word Smyrna. And in Revelation chapter 2, one of the 7 letters to the 7 churches was written to the church at Smyrna. And the making of myrrh was apparently an important business to Smyrna. Myrrh was used in the Old Testament as a beauty treatment and perfume, and it also had a pain-numbing effect. Jesus on the cross was offered wine that had myrrh mixed into it to deaden the pain, but he refused it. That's recorded in Mark chapter 15, verse 23. And the symbolic use here was that it was used in the embalming process. It was applied to the outside of a dead body to mitigate the odor. Nicodemus, who had earlier come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds of it in weight. That's recorded in John chapter 19, verse 39. So we see here myrrh being presented to Jesus after his birth and after his death. Jesus was born with a specific purpose to die. We all die, but the purpose of the birth of Jesus was to die for us. So first we saw overwhelming joy, second there was worship, and then third there's great sacrifice. All of those things should be present in our life with regards to Jesus. Verse 12, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. And we're told that they returned another way. Meeting Jesus should change the course of your life. It should change the path that you're on, and you don't go out the way that you came in. And we see that God guided their steps. Proverbs 20, verse 24 reads that a man's steps are from the Lord. How then can man understand his way? Now, given the size of this group, it would only have been by the hand of God that they could have exited without any kind of a confrontation from Herod or from the Romans. It would be impossible for a group of this size to hide. Okay, let's wrap this up here. When Jesus was born, there was no room at the inn. As a small child, there was certainly no room at the palace of Herod, and there was no room for him in the hearts of the religious leaders. And we see 3 responses here to the reality of the Messiah being born. The chief priests and the scribes, they had all the right answers. Their head was full, their hearts were empty. They had the knowledge, but they had no follow-through. And having seen this commotion from this large entourage, and having been asked the question by Herod, it's hard to fathom that they didn't, all of them, every one of them, race on down to Bethlehem to see what was going on, even if it was the most remote chance on earth that the Savior had been born. But there's no response at all recorded. They just seem to go back to doing whatever it was they're doing. They would have studied the coming of the Messiah their entire lives. They were all wrapped up in the busyness of religion. They had important work to do, and they had things they had to study. Herod worshipped himself and no doubt spent the rest of his life wondering where his star was. He was the king after all. And Herod wanted the message of Jesus wiped from the face of the earth. He did everything he thought that he could to make sure that the message would die and that the child would die. But the Magi, they saw the star and they rejoiced. And they saw the child and they worshiped. And they set off on a long and difficult journey, and their effort was rewarded. And in this we see Jesus rejected as a child, rejected throughout his ministry, and rejected at his death by the masses. And we see lots of people who react as if Jesus, just isn't relevant to their life. And we see a lot of people react to Jesus with hostility. But we see the overwhelming joy of those who accept him. Martin Luther is quoted as saying that people go through 3 conversions. They go through the conversion of the mind, the conversion of the heart, and the conversion of the pocketbook. The Magi had the intelligence to recognize the sign, and they had the heart to follow up on it. And they gave abundantly to the Lord once they found him. Well, what about you? Are you on a difficult journey? What do you hope to find at the end of it? Are you driven in search of something, not really knowing exactly what you'll find at the end of it? The Magi are looking for, they're going to give gifts to, they're going to contribute their resources to the only thing in the world that can change the world. It's my prayer for you that you will be filled with rejoicing and worshiping for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords this Christmas season.